All right, here we go. It is the System Failure Podcast, number 22B.
Well, 23B, right? We pushed out 22. We tried to do 23 last week, and we failed. Well, we put 23 in the can, only to find out that there was an issue with the SD card or something like that, Brian. Isn't that what happened?
Well, it turns out there's a lock on the SD card that you have to manually switch if you wish to record anything. So it is funny the way that entropy is always hanging out there waiting for you.
Yeah, it does seem like the yawning chasm of entropy swallowed yet another podcast. So we missed last week, but we're back, and we are ready to keep going.
Well, what's going on this week, Nate?
Oh, not much. I'm about to drive my fiancée to the airport to down to Boston because she is flying to Indonesia for a month in the sun while I stay here in the snow and work, which is unfortunate. But she's flying to our favorite airport, Istanbul. We have Istanbul's they have this beautiful brand new airport with all high end stores, Balenciaga and whatever. And they also have delicious food, like they call it the Grand Bazaar after Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, but it's really a huge food court in the airport. So they also have the Yotel, which is a mini hotel. It's kind of like a prostitute hotel where you just pay by the hour, but it's really handy if you've got 10 or 15 or 20 hours between flights. We've done some brutal stays in the Istanbul airport. So highly recommend that, the Yotel there.
I want to know about this food court. Is there like a Panda Express or...
No, it's all like traditional Turkish cuisine, and I have no idea what the names of the dishes are. You can get like your Turkish coffee and your Turkish delights, but they have all manner of other things, and you just basically get a big cafeteria tray, right? And you point to the dishes you want, and when you get to the end, they ring you up with an egregious bill. It's actually not too bad. I guess the Turkish lira, is that their currency, is in a state of collapse, so you get some nice, so things aren't too expensive there in the old Istanbul airport.
Yeah, well, haven't you run afoul of like the hot bar at LaGuardia or something?
Yeah.
It's like $25 a pound or something.
Yeah, right. If you like what is the new terminal at JFK, the JetBlue terminal? It's like Terminal C or something, Terminal 5 they call it. But yeah, I remember on one of my trips to and from Florida, I dared to go in there for the most modest of salads, but you have no idea what it's going to cost. You get to the end of the line, it's like $27, and that was 2009. That was eye-watering. So opposite experience in Istanbul. So,
it's just a little ironic. I mean, it is nice that Tracy there is going to get away and enjoy some warm weather, but it is like 65 degrees right now here in Portland, like on February 10th or whatever today
Very
is.
weird. Yeah, we're getting a strange heat wave. I guess we'll get back to winter weather soon enough here in the next couple of days. But it's making me feel stir crazy. Like I'm excited for spring also. And I wish I was also going to Indonesia, but as it is, I'm merely the chauffeur down to the Boston airport. So that'll be fun, and it'll be a month of bachelorhood for yours truly. So that'll be interesting. It'll give Tracy and I a chance to miss each other. The reunion's always fun at the other end. And in the meantime, I will be able to watch only the programs I've selected on the television. There won't be any negotiations, so that'll be pretty sweet, too.
Well, now the Super Bowl's over, we can get back to watching some hockey.
Yeah, I tried to tune into our Bruins yesterday, and they just lost 3-0. It was just the worst game I'd ever seen.
Ouch.
That was most unfortunate. Right. That's the transition, right? You go from the NFL, and then the Super Bowl comes and goes, and then you're into the NHL, right? That's the pro move.
All right, yeah. Well, what's going on with me? Yesterday I went down to Massachusetts and played some Magic the Gathering. It stank. But also, I haven't played any Magic the Gathering like in the last 2 months. I've been playing the guitar, man.
I see. You seem to go in fits and spurts with your Magic cards obsession. Be a lot of Magic cards, and then not some, and then you'll swear it off as the work of the devil, and then be back to it. So, is this part of that regular cycle, or do you think you're going to put down the Magic cards and never go back to them this time?
I guess it's just a question of how interesting the format is, and to play the kind of decks that I want to. And I guess it's not super hospitable to doing what I want to do, but I mean, maybe it'll seem good again at some point. But man, I've sure been playing a lot of guitar. See, I found out that there is like a tab on Songster for the Delicate Sound of Thunder version of Time, which David Gilmour always switches up the solos for the live versions, and he came up with this crazy solo for Time, and it's just a lot better than the studio version.
Wow.
It's interesting to see how it's better too, and like from like a theory standpoint, to see what it is he's doing that's different. And man, it's way less soul sucking, I guess, than grinding away over the computer, like peering at like this little digital display and trying to fathom what's going on with these little digital objects. I mean, that's what you want to be doing if you want to be good at Magic the Gathering. And so, yeah, playing guitar is certainly more exciting.
Yeah, there's really the things you can do with your time really fall into like two categories. You can either create or consume, and I would imagine that playing music falls more into the create category. And consume is when you're a rat in someone else's maze and they're making money off of you, and that's what Magic cards would be most likely. And oh, by the way, didn't I see that Magic is putting out a Fallout themed series or a Fallout themed expansion?
Yeah, well, they've done it with like Street Fighter and The Walking Dead, and I don't know how much I love these things, but I mean, it does bring people into the game, I guess.
They did Lord of the Rings too, eh? Because who was it that paid all those millions for the
Post
One
Malone?
Ring? Post Malone, yeah. Maybe not one of his finer investments, or maybe it's like expensive cars where they appreciate over time, and he'll be glad he did it.
Yeah, I mean, some Magic the Gathering cards are good investments, others not. I guess we'll see how that one stands. It does say 1 of 1 on it, and it's the only card on it like that says 1 of 1. But there are like millions of versions of that same card that don't say 1 of 1. So yeah, I don't know.
Speculative value versus exchange value. Use value versus exchange value. Where speculative value / exchange value. Very interesting.
I guess the other thing that's going on is I watched Jonah Hill's documentary a bit about him and his psychologist there.
It's a documentary?
Yeah.
It's like not scripted, that people are just talking about stuff that actually happened?
Well, it is. I don't know. He's trying to show how his psychologist does his thing. And to some extent it's scripted, but he also goes behind the scenes. So I guess it kind of goes in and out of being scripted, might say.
It's like a docudrama or something like that?
Yeah, but at some point, Jonah Hill, well, you know how he looks now. He's all skinny and whatnot. And he pulls out this blown up photo of himself from his younger days, like back in the super bad days. He was quite fat.
All right, yeah, I think about Barry from what is the name of that movie with the game designers? It's supposed to be Adam Sandler, but it had a different lead. Grandma's Boy, where that was like the first movie I ever saw him in, and he was like the loser of the group.
Right.
Yeah. Barry sucked on his first titty, right? Isn't that the
I forgot he was in that.
Yeah.
Well, in this blown up photo, he also has like bleach blonde hair and like a nose piercing in, and he's overall pretty revolting. And he's just talking about how like being fat when he was young like affected him, and so he spent his whole like adult life, or his whole life, I guess, trying to like get away from like this photo that you see of him where he looks terrible. Well,
I mean, I see what you're saying, but didn't he like lean into the fat clown role and get paid millions of shekels for, didn't he like kind of... I'm just wondering if that figures in, having not seen the movie. Like, I mean, didn't he accept a massive paycheck to be the clown, the jester? Be the loser court sort of for these movies, Superbad. And
I think what he would say is that being successful didn't do anything to quell his anxiety.
Well, being successful, but being the clown to be successful, I can see why that would definitely. Yeah, if you're the person everyone's laughing at, I mean, it's great that you have a healthy bank account, but it's got to be devastating for the psyche.
Well, also, I mean, he got, skinnier and did roles then, and that also didn't quell his anxiety, I think is what he would say.
I see.
And that success in general didn't solve the problem. And what they're getting at there, see, they get into, like, the Jungian shadow self a bit there. And, like, what he's saying, I guess, is what he tries to do now is, like, love this photo of himself. Rather than try to get away from it, or he tries to listen to it specifically, which I guess I think is good advice. If you're trying to like escape yourself, is like it's like you're listening and attention or whatever. that you have to give to yourself rather than escapism, right?
Well, I don't know. Okay, so I think that there is value to people get caught in cycles of behavior. Joe Dispenza talks about this. People get caught in cycles of behavior, and you end up sort of being haunted by your old self. So isn't it better to like kill the past and let it die? Like when you have a ship and someone's trying to board your ship in the movies, they always throw the grappling hooks, attached to the ropes onto, and you have to like take the axe and sever those ropes as fast as the crew trying to board your ship can board. Like, so isn't it best to try to escape from old patterns of thought in the past? I mean, I guess doing the exact opposite thing you've done in the past, you're still reacting to this past version of yourself that doesn't really exist, right? It's nothing but a mental impression, right? Your relationship with your past self is entirely conceptual. It's going to be based on a lot of false memories, right? I mean,
well, I think what you're trying to do is sort of stop the wobble. Like if you're having like these bipolar highs and lows, you gotta like sort of reintegrate with yourself, right?
Yeah.
And I think trying to kill the past is definitely the opposite of that. So I don't know. I'm not like a Jungian expert, but I don't know. I think you have to try to like listen to that photo of yourself or like that past self and understand like what it wants rather than try to stuff it down, I guess. Like stuffing it down is like not the way.
Yeah. Well, leaning into it is still, you're still like relating to this thing from the past. I don't know. I guess I don't know. In some ways, the past is like valuable. It's like it's how you think of yourself as who you are. Like it's your sense of identity. But when in cases where it's self-limiting, is it better to not navigate with reference to that past at all, or is it best, or should you use the past as an example of what not to do, what not to be, what do what Jonah Hill? It sounds like you're saying Jonah Hill is doing, and just do the opposite of what you've normally done. Where you would normally zig, you instead zag going forward. And try to change your life that way, or is it better, like I'm saying, to abandon the zigzag pattern altogether and not navigate with reference to it whatsoever? But what was that? How did the movie conclude? Did Jonah Hill have a message for us all? Is that basically the message? Is he happier now, or is it just does his tension remain unresolved?
Well, he's doing better, and that's why he's made the movie, because he wants to get the message of his psychologist out there, and he's having his psychologist put out, trying to give people some tools. Another thing that he talks about is just you have to like accept that, I don't know, like work is like the nature of life, right? And so you're gonna have to like life isn't gonna be like cushy and soft, right?
Yeah.
So they're just trying to give some tools out there, and I think it depends on what kind of relationship you have with self-loathing, I think, right, is what ultimately what it comes down to. And so if you're caught in some kind of self-loathing pattern, I'd probably recommend watching the movie.
All right. Well, that's interesting. I mean, it's doubly interesting how much Jungian psychology is coming up these days, how much psychedelics, there's a connection there between Jungian psychology and psychedelics.
Yeah, well, Jung could obviously, I don't know, I'm not like really an expert on Jung, but obviously Jung has a huge influence, like you're saying, like with the UFOs also, Jung had a lot to say about that. Jung could obviously like see something about the human nature. He could see it the way it is, and it's not like quite what you would expect. And this business of the shadow self like plays into that. And so like there's a shadow self in the sense of how you like you might hate your past self or see this like unlovable golem sort of thing. But also there's like your shadow self and how you feel like about people around you and the way you negotiate relationships. Yeah. And like when you have like disdain for someone, you're still interacting with your own view of the world, so it's kind of like having disdain for yourself. And I don't quite know how you're supposed to negotiate all of that. But yeah, Jung is like a genius and had his finger on the pulse of like all this. And yeah, I mean, yeah, he's a veritable well of relevance, what with the psychedelics and the UFOs and all that.
It's his big Jung's, as far as I haven't read a single one of Jung's books, although I aspire to. But my understanding is that he thinks in terms of archetypes. In other words, it could be true to say that Jungian philosophy or Jungian psychology is a redux of Platonistic philosophy. And you could also say that Christianity is a redux of Platonistic philosophy, and that the magic of the Renaissance that brought us modern science is a redux of Platonism. And so it's very interesting to me to note that these things percolate, these bubbles, if our culture's a big stew, these specific ingredients keep bubbling up whenever there's a disaster, whenever you have the slave society of Rome collapse, or the medieval economy collapse, or in the case of the present day, as it's a perpetual artifact of system failure to suggest that capitalism is a system that is in a state of decline and collapse. And in this late stage capitalist environment here, once again, we find the UFOs, the lights in the sky, the Jungian philosophy, aka Platonism, all swirling together in a crazy mixture that is really, man, it sure is a wild time to be alive.
Here's something I've been thinking about. Like, what does it mean to say that the system has failed? Because, we've talked about how the system probably ultimately failed back in 2008. Was like a key moment, although there's several key moments. The crazy bailouts back during the COVID would also be some indication of that. But, really, I would say the system has failed because, no one really believes in democracy anymore, right? It's just that our reptilian overlords are engaged in a crazy power grab, and we're all doing what we can about it. Are you
saying no one believes in democracy as a virtue or a value, or that no one believes we have a democracy anymore?
Yeah, B.
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah. I think everyone wishes we had a democracy, and everyone laments the fact that what we had instead have is an oligarchy. Highly regrettable.
Yeah, it's Well, was it our last podcast where I talked to the Palestinian protesters?
Yes.
I went and talked to the Palestinian protesters, and none of them I asked them who they were going to vote for, and none of them support, the Democratic candidate. And it's a huge issue on the left, which has, emphasized, fairness or equity, and this whole business of supporting Israel, carpet bombing Palestinian neighborhoods, is a real problem for the brand of the Democratic Party, right?
Yeah.
And so this issue has just it's just another brick in the wall, right? That makes it clear that, we just don't. Everyone knows we don't have the democracy. It's a huge lie. And we have the lights in the sky.
For those keeping score at home, that's Pink Floyd reference number 2 for podcast for System Failure podcast number 23. Highly satisfying.
Oh yes,
and I think that you would have to, in 1999, you would really have to. It would be hard to have the sorts of conversations that people have now about the deep state, for example. That everyone just assumes the deep state exists now, but that even in 2010, that was a crazy conspiracy term. But what I think. I think that enough people have lost faith in the system now to where it's not really all that controversial to suggest we're in a state of system collapse. But what I think it means is that the system is unable to replicate itself over time. So it's not able, in 2025, the system will be less functional than it was in 2024. And also we're hurtling towards an inflection point. I think that inflection point got set in stone in 2008. We allowed the private bankers to connect their private debt problem to our debt-based currency, and thereby guaranteed an impending sovereign debt crisis. Their private debt crisis is in the process of being converted into a sovereign debt crisis that we're going to have to deal with. You can just look at how many dollars have been printed, even just since 2020, versus how many dollars overall there are. I think that's what it means to have the system be in decline. It can't replicate itself into the future in just the way that the economic system of peasants and lords couldn't replicate itself any further than the 15th century, and the slave society of Rome couldn't replicate itself past the 4th century. We're now at another major turning of the age, and when the ages turn, then reality itself breaks down, which is fascinating, and that's what I think is happening to us. That's why I think Jonah Hill has got a movie about Jungian psychology and why there are lights in the sky and the drums of war in the Holy Land, and of course, we all know the list at this point.
I guess we'd probably, for the system to continue, right, we're going to need to have another 9/11 style attack on our freedom, or like the COVID. And so I guess I think the system's going to grind on, in that there's not going to be like an overnight kind of change. And I don't know, I guess it's just one of the ways in which the system has collapsed. But it's kind of a big deal that, I think, prior to 2016, if you... I think people would have some faith in democracy, and I think that faith is absolutely gone now.
Well, it's not. It's never been. What's happening? I don't. Do you think? I would not think that most people would see what's happening as a referendum on democracy. There are people that don't even see it as a referendum on capitalism. They just say, "Well, this is just crony capitalism." They sound just like the people who, when people who want to advocate for communism, then you bring up the worst excesses of the Soviet Union or of the Great Leap Forward in China. People say, well, yeah, but that wasn't real communism. And so now that, much like Thelma and Louise, our capitalist system has gone over the edge of the canyon, just a few short decades after the communist system of the Soviet communist system in the early 90s. Now people will say, it's not the problem we're having is not real capitalism, it's crony capitalism. But I think that what's really at issue here is that it's the simple prophecy that's now 150 years old. The technology will destroy. The system of employees and employers is doomed to go the way of the system of peasants and lords. And I think that the real inflection point isn't even necessarily the sovereign debt crisis that we in the United States have signed ourselves up for, because this is a problem that's happening over the entire modern world. I think the real inflection point has to do with debt. The more technology replaces workers, the less workers will be able to negotiate for wages at the bargaining table with their employers, and the more of the pie the employers can keep for themselves. If you think of employers as a toll booth, right? You have a mass of people who create goods and services and a mass of people who consume goods and services, and that's a virtuous cycle, like the icon for recycling. It's just arrows, going around in a big circle. But what the people who own the means of production can do is charge a toll. Like, they charge a premium in the way that a ticket scalper out in front of TD Garden will charge a premium on a Bruins ticket. They are in a position to collect a toll on that cycle, and the money they collect comes out of the economy where money is flowing in a virtuous cycle, and ends up sequestered where it can't impact the economy. And then you end up with people who are addicted to that wealth accumulation and can't stop. And even though they can't ever spend this money, and their children will never be able to spend this money, they still keep trying to run up the score. The old saying, a million seconds is like 11 days, but a billion seconds is like 32 years. And people, these billionaires, like they're just out to get the high score, despite the fact that it's functionally useless to them. And so I think that the inflection point we're hurtling towards is the moment when the way that we've kept that cycle running, even though there is a predator, a third party siphoning money out of that cycle, that's leaving shortfalls. What I mean by shortfall is the workers, collectively in the United States, don't have enough money to buy back from themselves the goods and services that they're producing when they go to work, because there's a third party leeching money out of the system, taking that profit. And the way that we've kept the system running is with debt. It's the 1970s when technology like international long-haul flights or international communications allowed us to offshore most of our economy. Unprecedented in the history of the economics, voluntarily deindustrialization of your own country, moving our own factories from the United States to within the borders of our chief economic rivals. It's a terrible blunder. It would be comical if it wasn't our country doing it. But the way that we've made up, we fired all the domestic workforce stateside, let them just fend for themselves in the gig economy. And the way that we've made up for the fact that we have all these goods for sale at Walmart coming from overseas, but except for the workers here don't get paid enough to buy it all, is with debt. The difference between what people consume and what money they've earned is the debt. And the inflection point is admitting that so much of the wealth of billionaires is reckoned in future receipts. In accounting, accounts receivable, like the money that you expect to receive is just as good as $1 in the bank now. It's counted the same. And so much of the wealth of the wealthy is reckoned in anticipated future receipts. That is, we, the regular unwashed masses, may not have enough money to buy what we need now, so put it on our credit tab, and then someday we'll pay that tab. And so we have solved the problem of the fact that the workers don't have enough money to consume the goods and services that they themselves produce. We've solved that problem by borrowing the money back from the wealthy, who are the third-party parasites, the toll booth in this equation. And admitting that those debts aren't going to be paid is the real thing we don't want to admit. In 2008, the corrupt banks like Wells Fargo wrote all these bad loans to all of these folks who could never pay it back. And the solution to that is to write down the loan to the actual ability of the borrower to pay the loan. But instead of that, we just got out the money printer, printed the dollars, and then monetized these loans, bought them at face value, so that the people who own the banks and the wealthy who own these loans wouldn't have to take a write down on the value of their balance sheets. And so that's what we're really putting off, is admitting that all of this wealth of the billionaires is really anticipated future receipts from all of us. And we're just going to have to admit at a certain point that there's not enough money in the economy to actually pay all these debts. And so that admission is what is the real can we're kicking down the road. Does that make any sense? I think so.
Yeah, well, we've talked about it for 23 episodes, I'm pretty sure.
So that's when you say, well, what does it mean that a system can't replicate itself? Well, that's what I mean. Like, we are reaching a point where we have to hold up our hands and say, okay, we just have to admit that the gears are grinding to a halt here. We've got real dysfunction, and we're going to have to do something fundamentally different about how we organize the production and then the distribution of goods and services.
Well, I mean, we can just have another 9/11 style attack on our freedoms, though. And
right.
That'll stop that from happening.
That's the alternative, right? You can just lock people, and that's really what COVID was all about. If you ask me, and I know you agree too, it was like, well, we're just going to shut everything down and then send everyone checks, and we're just going to create this whole synthetic economy and just keep the scenario just ticking along for just another year or two. Do you remember what was happening in 2019? We had major issues at the repo window at the Federal Reserve, where, if you you're a huge bank and I'm a huge bank, and people come and take money in and out of each of our banks all day long. But the Federal Reserve requires us to have a certain amount of our deposits and actual cash on hand. And so if you have more than you need and I have less than I need, I'm just going to borrow for you overnight to balance our books. And that thing where huge banks can just put a couple million in, take a couple million out to balance their books so that they're compliant with the reserve requirements from the Fed. I mean, that thing, people don't want to, leading into 2020, people didn't want to. It was getting really, really expensive to use the repo window. In other words, people weren't. Ideally, there'd be a bunch of banks who need money and a bunch of banks who want to loan money, but no banks were loaning money, and so the price jacked up, the overnight interest rate jacked up. Just an example of the plumbing rattling and shaking ominously, and. But then COVID came along, and and the yield curve was inverted. The price of it was cheaper to buy. It was cheaper to buy debt with a 10-year maturity than a 2-year maturity. I mean, it's just it was wild times in late 2019. But then we had an excuse to shut everyone down and just create this whole synthetic economy where the government just mails out checks to everyone. And but now we need another crisis to do that trick again, because the actual economy where people create goods, generate goods and services, and then buy them isn't working. It doesn't exist anymore. It's long gone.
Yeah. So how long until the next crisis?
Yeah.
If Donald Trump gets elected, I think it'll happen very soon.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's the question everyone wants to know. When is the big crash coming? One thing that's definitely happening is that history is speeding up as we go here. Things seem to be speeding up at the pace of technology, the provision of technology, the advent of technology increases at an exponential rate. So where if you lived in France in the 11th century, you would never see. You might see one improvement to a plow handle or something your whole life, but we've watched the internet come, and then cell phones come, and now AI. I mean, the technology that's coming down the pipe that will absolutely change our lives forever is just one after another every few years at this point. Pretty wild. Yeah.
Well, it was like 18 years between 9/11 and COVID or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I'd have to imagine it won't be 18 years until the next one.
Yeah, I agree.
Along with the rate of technology and whatnot, too.
Well, speaking of the collapse of the world order, I did have a chance to listen to Dr. Brett Weinstein on the border crisis. We talked about this in our Lost Pod number 23, but I reckon it deserves a rehash here and now. How much do you remember from that pod, Brian? Because now will have been 2 weeks since you listened to it.
Well, I mean, Brett Weinstein was down in Panama and revealed the shocking nature of the immigration situation down there. Yeah,
I guess there's a Pan-American highway that goes from Alaska all the way to down to the tip of Argentina, and so you can literally drive from from Tierra del Fuego all the way to Alaska, except for there's one 60-mile gap, the Darien Gap, there in Panama. And so Dr. Weinstein flew down to Panama and reported back to all the rest of us. And I think he was on Tucker's pod, right? Isn't that who was interviewing him?
Yep.
And he reported that there's a lot of migrant activity, and then also a lot of like Chinese nationals down there too, and a lot of folks moving through through Central America. I guess the deal is that you can fly into Lima, Peru without a visa, and so you fly into Lima, Peru, and then you make your way through Colombia, and then north into Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, where there's the 60-mile Darien Gap, and it's just the Wild West. It's just people are just trying to make their way through this jungle any way they can, and people being robbed and raped, and it's a crazy scene. And then, as mentioned, there are like South American migrants, and then there's also a lot of Chinese nationals who are also doing this migration, and it's and that was really there weren't a lot of like concrete takeaways from the pod, just that it's very odd that this is happening, and how can we understand why would the Chinese be sending people through Panama? What is going on? Is there some kind of nefarious play on here? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I do think that thinking in terms of countries, thinking in terms of a globe where every inch of the globe except Antarctica is whacked up into countries is an old 600-year-old way of thinking of things that I think is passing away. Said another way, I think that if we regard the Treaty of Westphalia, signed in 1648, as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, modern era with its capitalism, then the whole business of having nations with the whole world whacked up into nations with international borders is only as old as that Treaty of Westphalia. And I don't think this is the way we'll always conceive of international geopolitics. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. He has a Indian name, and he is like one of these Silicon Valley venture capitalist guys. I'm now blanking on his name, but he wrote a book about like the end of the old way of thinking of nations, and like his idea is like, well, you could really, it doesn't, people's geographic with the coming of the internet, people's geographic location. Balaji Srinivasan, that's the name of the man who I was blanking. Balaji, he says, because of the internet, your geographical location doesn't really matter so much anymore. You could be governed by your preferred tax policy, your preferred set of political theories. You really doesn't matter who you live among physically, because because so much of business is done online, and so much of our lives are virtual now. You could really belong to a country of your choice without ever actually moving. And so there may be geographical borders, and the idea of nation states is something that is passing into history the same way that the capitalist system of employers and employees is passing into history, right? If the Treaty of Westphalia ended something called an unpleasant episode called the 30 Years' War, which really was about the final culmination of the Protestant Reformation. The idea is that there are now these things called international borders, and the Pope is no longer allowed to cross those international borders with his edicts and control what goes on in other countries. This was what the Protestant Reformation was fought over. And indeed, the thing that touched off the 30 Years' War was the incident in Prague, where some Catholic administrators from the emperor tried to inform the good people of Bohemia, that they would not be allowed to be Protestant, that they were going to have to be Catholic, and so they chucked them out the window. A whole bunch of army. It was like dominoes falling, just like World War One. And before you know it, all of Europe was plunged into this 30 Years' War. And at the end of it, when all the dust had settled, they said, okay, no more letting the Pope go into other people's countries and tell them what religion they have to be. We're going to whack up the entire world into... Before this, you'd have like nation states, right? Like you'd have the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and when Florence was its main city, and that's where people ruled from, and it would be like surrounding agrarian farmlands, surrounding your city-state. So the world was dotted with city-states, but not fully whacked up into countries prior to 1648. And so I'm wondering if just listening to Brett Weinstein talk about how, the borders just don't mean anything. People just streaming across the borders. It's being used for political reasons here in the United States. Obviously, there are business interests that love the unpaid labor. There are political interests that love the human interest story of the poor mother with her children trying to build a better life for herself. Accusations of racism for those that are opposed to restriction to immigration is also politically useful. And then you have the Chinese government, which our economies are tied together. Like we're their big market. We're buying so many of their products. But on the other hand, they're trying to outcompete us and become the top dog economically. And oh, by the way, the Chinese hold tons and tons of our treasury bonds, and they would love to see us fail, except for a lot of their wealth is reckoned in our treasury bonds. So it's a messy, complex situation. And I just wonder if the old way of thinking, the old Treaty of Westphalia way of thinking of nations is on its way out, and that Balaji Srinivasan's vision of digital countries or digital political blocks is the way of the future. I don't know. What did you think? Go ahead.
Well, there's the business of the joint venture of researching the COVID also.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. We I guess it was Obama that banned the designer custom diseases, the development thereof here in the United States. So the NIH just moved it over to China, possibly in violation of that. I'm not unclear, but that's really interesting. The development, the lab leak theory suggests that the genesis of COVID was a joint venture between the U.S. and China. Very, very odd.
Well, at any rate, obviously, the world's elite are all in lockstep, especially through the World Health Organization. It's just everything since Donald Trump got elected. Everyone's gotten in lockstep, basically. And I would say it's definitely the case that the Westphalian model is on the outs.
Yeah.
I don't know what it means to have all these Chinese people being, corralled up this corridor into the United States. Yeah, certainly no one's talking about it besides Brett Weinstein. I guess Joe Rogan was talking to Aaron Rodgers about it a bit. And I've seen some stuff about it, but there's that one area where Texas wants to put up the razor wire and stuff. And I guess there's a giant hole a half mile in the other direction. So it's just some political canard or something. Yeah.
I saw that too. I understand why Dr. Weinstein wanted to go down to Panama, because it's so confusing. You get some people are oh, there's no crisis at all at the border, and others say it's an existential threat, and I just don't know. And who knows? A lot of things like abortion get drummed up to, I think, distract us from the economic, the illogical economic reality we're facing. So yeah, it would be interesting to go down there, because I heard that same thing where it's all a show and it's all put on, for consumption. The border crisis, but I don't know. Dr. Weinstein's report seemed pretty sober and pretty concerning. So at least, I believe something's going on down there. Man, it's so hard to figure out what's the dealio in this day and age of when just the mainstream media has completely abdicated their responsibility as our truth finding apparatus to try to figure out what's going on in the world. Ugh.
Well, it seems pretty clear that we are being inundated with migrants, and former sanctuary cities like New York are telling immigrants not to come anymore. It's to what end?
Yeah, do the Democrats want to get all these people registered to vote so they can all vote Democrat? I did see one of these representatives was suggesting that they should be allowed to sign up for the military, even and then be awarded American citizenship for their service in the military, which is like the idea of using foreign mercenaries for your military misadventures is that was like Rome's signature blunder. So that's an interesting piece to the puzzle. But yeah.
Well, I like how Brett Weinstein was saying in that podcast that we have to start considering hypotheses that seem crazy.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much where we're at now.
Well, that's just it, isn't it? Like reality, when your economic system goes belly up, like so do like conceptions of reality, because conceptions of reality are always spun by the authorities, and the authorities are always trying to, like, if you sit atop a huge money-making scheme, an exploitative money-making scheme, you're going to do everything you can to keep those rivers of wealth flowing in your direction. And so the authorities, like the priestly class, is always a big part of who the authorities are. And the priestly class is usually, the emperor is always exposed as having no clothes in times like this. So I think that unless it's a tough one, because people who sound crazy might be crazy, or they might actually be on the right track. Like the first people who suggested that the Earth revolves around the sun instead of vice versa would have seemed crazy. You could just, any fool could look in the sky and see the sun moving. They would have just seemed like lunatics. But I think when reality breaks down, the only people who can be right are the people who sound crazy. So I appreciate folks like Brett Weinstein being willing to consider hypotheses that seem outlandish. I think that's where we're at, if we're honest, at this point.
Well, I think we're doing that very thing on this podcast with the UFOs and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
And whatnot.
You mentioned talking to the Palestinian protesters the week before last weekend, and I do regret that there's not a single presidential candidate who, like, I feel like the Donald and Biden and RFK Jr. all have exactly the same foreign policy with respect to Gaza and Israel. Which is highly lamentable, but I think I guess I'm still rooting for RFK Jr., of course. Ultimately, I'm rooting for 2024 to be the year where people really wake up and we really have a new reckoning with Platonism and with the lights in the sky and with the corrupt the regulatory capture and corruption that has just brought this country to a halt. And I was interested to tune into the Adam. I watched Dr. Drew do an interview with Dave Rubin, and I also listened to a random Corolla pod from last week. And I guess now the Ace Man is all in on RFK Jr., which is exciting to hear. He had been at RFK Jr.'s birthday party the week before, like the night before, I mean.
The Ace Man.
Yeah. So the Ace Man went to RFK Jr.'s private birthday party and was hanging out with, what's the name of RFK's wife, who plays the wife of Larry David on Curb Your Enthusiasm, Cheryl Hines. Yeah, that's hanging out with those guys. And so K Jr. is going to be on the Corolla pod soon. And so Corolla's all in on it's like the entire podcast sphere is like all in on RFK, from Joe Rogan to Dr. Drew to Corolla, which is interesting to see. Dr. Drew was like a totally straight guy, like in terms of just believing in the system before COVID. But he says he's been radicalized by COVID, is now willing to believe some seriously crazy things about the system in which he lives, which I was like, wow. Dr. Drew did say the truth about Hillary Clinton prior to COVID, that she looked like she wasn't doing well, and then she was collapsed. I forgot about that. You're right. Yeah,
got booted off of CNN.
Yeah, they punted Dr. Drew off CNN because he said that she didn't look healthy. In 2016, that is really interesting. Well, I reckon that the rise of the Donald, as you mentioned, which resulted in the system going through its antibody sort of immune response to the arrival of an outsider on the political chessboard. To your point 2 podcasts ago from episode 22, I do kind of agree that the chessboard, it was heavily impacted, but now it's kind of rolled back onto its keel and has become stable again. That's why I'm rooting for RFK. But if the rise of the Donald was a recognition was like a result of 2008, in 2016. Maybe we can get, but then the Donald he's not really draining the swamp, right? He's like I say, he's kind of like the chessboard is it's compensated for his presence.
Well, the Trump can expose the swamp, but I don't think he can drain it.
Maybe that's the best way to put it. Yeah. But I feel like RFK Jr. could actually, when you talk about draining the swamp, he's actually going to fire the regulators and actually get the corruption out of the Justice Department and the FDA and the CDC. These have been his bailiwicks for decades at this point, and I feel like maybe his election in 2024, though it won't solve all of America's problems, and it certainly won't solve the issue with Gaza and the Middle East. Everything else he says is nearly perfect. So it's interesting to see all of the major podcast personalities all line up on the side of RFK Jr. Do you think that Tucker Carlson's going to have an endorsement of RFK Jr. before November? I mean, I would be shocked if he didn't. And so it's interesting I just wonder how relevant the podcast verse is to real life. Has it supplanted the old mainstream media paradigm that was still alive and kicking very well in 2016 and barely hanging on in 2020? Has it finally gone belly up? I hope so. It'll be very curious to see how this the wall-to-wall excitement about RFK on the podcast circuit translates into real life in November. Very curious to see how that turns out.
Well, I did listen to Dave Smith's full interview with RFK about Israel. And RFK was bringing up some points about the Suez Canal and shipping lanes and whatnot. And he sounds like he cares about Palestinian people, but he thinks that Hamas has to be ousted. I mean, he was sort of on his back foot during some spots in the interview, but I guess at the end, I don't know. I guess it was. I felt somewhat better about the situation, but I don't really know what to do about this Hamas problem. It probably would have big ramifications for the geopolitical landscape if we just stop supporting Israel. I guess the Suez Canal is a big deal.
Yeah, big shipping lanes, a lot of oil too. The Middle East is also all about oil. I mean, we used Israel as a weapons platform to menace the entire Middle East. I listened to this pod too, but I don't remember what was RFK Jr.'s specific point on Suez. Do you remember that?
Well, it was towards the end, and I think he was just saying there's going to be big political ramifications if we stop supporting Israel, because Hamas would probably try to oust the Israelis altogether, and I don't know, there'd be a big impact.
The Suez Canal is currently under the possession of the Egyptians. Now, it was occupied by the Israelis from 1967 to 73, whenever it was, for a couple of years. Right in that 1967 war, the Israelis occupied the Sinai. And then it was the Camp David Accords where they gave it back to Egypt, but kept the West Bank. I think that my history is right there. But I'm not unclear. Does that mean Palestinians? I'm not. Yeah, it's just I'm not quite sure.
Well, I guess RFK didn't sound like he was naive about the situation in any case.
Yeah. There's some realpolitik going on there with RFK. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I don't know why. America has to be the world police, and that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, that's what I heard too. It's RFK Jr. is just talking about how terrible the Hamas leaders are. He makes it differentiates between they and the Palestinians at large. But the idea that this one organization is just so bad that we have to do yet another foreign intervention and send yet more boys from Oklahoma and Ohio out to lose their lives or their limbs fighting this unique threat. I just don't care anymore. It's no, let's not have any wars of any kind. It doesn't go well for us ever at all. But on the other hand, it's interesting to note that Suez was involved in the demolition of the British Empire. Was it 1959, the Suez Affair, where Nasser, I think, was the leader of Egypt at the time, and he wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal and remove British control. The British had controlled that thing since the 1800s. And I guess the Suez incident, where Egypt was able to establish control of the Suez Canal and kick the British out, despite them publicly saying they were going to try to keep it. I guess that was a major humiliation for the Brits and a big part of the dissolution of their empire that ultimately ended with them devaluing their currency and it was just, I guess it's interesting that the Suez Canal figured so heavily into the death of the British Empire. It's like Afghanistan, one of these places where everyone's empire dies, whether it's the Alexander or the Brits or the Soviets or the Americans. It's like invading Afghanistan is the first wrong move every time. If you want to dispose of an empire, there's no faster and surer way to do it than to mount an invasion of Afghanistan.
Well, it'd be nice to live like Sweden didn't lock its people down during the COVID, right?
Yeah.
And they're not like responsible for maintaining peace in the Middle East. I mean, we're really like on the vanguard of all the madness because like the military industrial complex needs to harness our economic output to keep this thing lumbering along.
Yeah, we need to protect the petrodollar. We need to artificially gin up demand for the dollar by making sure that the oil is only traded for dollars on the world market, say.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to we have to deal with like a crazy amount of propaganda. And then our economic system is terrible, so we have to deal with tons of homeless people. And then our medical system is terrible, so everyone's fat, and they're trying to ram COVID vaccinations on us. And oh man, it's crazy.
Yeah, we are in the tension, the fundamental tension I think that we're experiencing is between corporate profits and the public good. And there were, for a long time, corporate profits and the public good were aligned, but there is the departure. Those two goals have diverged from each other, and so now we can either have corporate profits or the public good. And corporate profits have been winning since the 70s, and public good has been losing since the 70s. And we're now really reaching a point where we can't, in both of our political parties, are really here to goose corporate profits and not at all here to help the public good. And so that's been the fundamental breakdown in democracy to which you alluded at the top of this podcast, or the feeling that our democracy isn't functional or it doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. Oof, yeah, it's interesting times to be alive, that's for sure.
See, I guess I just want to say about all that, it's like ultimately the system will have failed when everyone agrees it has failed, right?
Yeah.
And just the business in the Middle East is just a big. All the lefties are starting to see it too, because they don't care about like Donald Trump isn't like. I don't think it's just the issue. Like I mean, people care more about the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East than Donald Trump, or at least some people do. I see it on Twitter. And talking to the Palestinian protesters, you hear the same sentiment.
Yeah, and the more the system tries to be biased against the Donald, the more popular the Donald becomes. Right? It's like the more disillusioned people become with the system. There is it's directly proportional how much the court cases and the one-sided media coverage on the Donald. There's a relationship between how much that makes people like the Donald in spite of the establishment, excuse me, and how disillusioned people are getting with the system. And yeah, I really think I think in 2016 Hillary Clinton, she didn't even go to Wisconsin. You remember, the stories about her, just assuming. Just having a totally a political strategy totally disconnected from reality, not even visiting Wisconsin, one of these states that is normally blue but could be purple, and so I think that the political class was caught off guard by 2016. They thought that they didn't even though 55% of the country was just I have a mortgage that works and a job that I like and I just want things to go smoothly and I don't want a bunch of upheaval. That was most people in 2016. And I think it was 50-50 in 2020. But I think now in 2024 it's going to be 55% of people want the upheaval and only 45% of us have the mortgage and the job that's working for us. And I think that again has everything to do with 2008. They really, in the wake of 2008, people were standing out in front of those banks on Wall Street on Wall Street protesting the massive bailouts and identifying themselves as the 99%. And that's when we had all of the woke stuff start to percolate. It can't be a coincidence. I think that that's all part of I think that comes our way from like the Disney and Nike. These corporations have created this woke business this woke canard that distracts from the economic realities, and that's that's really the silver lining to the October 7th cloud. The defense of that agenda was always like, well, if you don't support this, you're a bigot. Immigration figures into this. Like if you are for any kind of restriction on immigration, then you must be a bigot, was the thinking for a long time. But October 7th really broke that. The hordes of young people who looked with horror on Joe Biden's unconditional support of Israel in the wake of October 7th got called bigots by the establishment for daring to suggest that maybe the destruction of tens of thousands of Palestinian children was no way not a response at all to the acts of October 7th. So that's what I think about when you mentioned going down and talking to the pro-Palestinian protesters. Like these people now are homeless, politically homeless because their criticism of Joe Biden. The use of calling people a bigot and terminating the conversation there is gone now because of the situation in Gaza. So, and I think all that is directly connected to the economic realities that I just filibustered about for the last 5 minutes here.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, it's exciting stuff because at least people don't seem to be falling for the propaganda, and people are not in love with it, and people are recognizing the system is failing. So
yeah, I sure hope 2024 is the year that finally a critical mass of us say, well, that emperor has no clothes on whatsoever. He turns out he's naked.
We can only hope.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, with that, I guess I should encourage our listeners to send us an email and let us know why we're crazy. You can reach us at not at substack.com as the email address, knopp at substack.com. And if you want to read some exciting essays about the end of the world, why, then you can just point your browser to not.substack.com and read some delightful essays written by yours truly. And we hope to see you online.
All right, we'll see you.
All right.